The night was heavy with an electric stillness, the kind of quiet that almost felt unnatural, as though the city itself held its breath. Neon signs flickered above the sidewalk, casting fragmented pools of light on cracked pavement. The pulse of the metropolis seemed distant, muffled by the suffocating grip of the cold that seeped into every corner of the alley. Here, on the fringes of society, time moved differently. The world of the well-off was a blur beyond the towering skyline, its promises of luxury and comfort both distant and elusive. In this forgotten space, only survival mattered, stripped down to its rawest form. Eli, a boy barely 16, was pressed against the cold brick wall of a crumbling building. His coat, once black, was now a faded patchwork of grime, and his shoes had long since surrendered to the relentless assault of the streets. His face, sharp with youthful defiance, had been chiseled by hardship, though he still carried the remnants of innocence. Eyes that burned with untapped potential. He was a wanderer, a ghost in a city that had long since forgotten the names of those who lived in its shadows. The weight of his situation pressed heavily on him. His stomach growled with an emptiness that gnawed at his insides, but hunger had become a familiar companion. It was the thought of his future, or lack thereof, that aided him most. As a boy with no family, no ties to anything or anyone, his existence had been reduced to a series of survival tactics, each more desperate than the last. People ignored him, avoided him, as if his presence alone might contaminate their pristine lives. But even in the darkest corners of the city, he dreamed of something beyond the streets, something that wasn't measured in scraps of food or nights spent huddled in abandoned buildings. The air was thick with the scent of burning trash, mingled with the faint metallic tang of rain that hadn't yet arrived. Eli wrapped his arms tighter around himself, pulling his coat closer. His mind, sharp and restless, began to wander, imagining what his life might be if things had been different. He could have been anyone, someone who had the luxury of choices, who didn't have to rely on stolen moments of sleep or the kindness of strangers. But life had other plans. The city had stripped him of everything but his will to endure. A distant rumble interrupted his thoughts, the sound of a car engine growing louder. Eli's eyes darted toward the noise, a reflexive action. It was the sound of opportunity, or more likely, the sound of danger. The sleek black car slid around the corner of the alley, the tires screeching as it came to an abrupt stop. Its windows were tinted, the interior hidden from view. For a moment, it seemed as if the world had frozen. The car a dark silhouette against the backdrop of flickering lights. The door opened with a soft hiss, and a figure stepped out, tall, sharp, commanding. Eli's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the man, though he had never seen him in person before. Elon Musk. The name echoed in his mind with a strange blend of awe and disbelief. The richest man in the world, the one whose face had been plastered across every media outlet, whose innovations had reshaped the world. Yet here he was, standing in front of Eli, his presence almost otherworldly. Eli froze. His body went tense, a mixture of fear and curiosity locking him in place. What was a man like Musk doing in a place like this? What could he possibly want with a boy like him? The air shifted, the temperature dropping even further as if the world itself had drawn back in anticipation. Musk's gaze met Eli's, and for a moment, it felt like time itself paused. There was no pity in those eyes, no condescension, just a quiet intensity. Something unreadable flickered in his expression, something that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. He took a slow step toward Eli, the echoes of his polished shoes on the pavement unervingly clear. "You're not supposed to be here," Musk said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made the words feel like an accusation. "This isn't where people like you belong." Eli's heart raced, his mind scrambling to find a response, but none came. Instead, he stood there, as if the very ground beneath his feet had shifted, pulling him into an unspoken confrontation. Musk studied him for a moment longer, his face unreadable, before his eyes softened, just slightly. It was a brief moment, but it was enough to make Eli question everything. The man's next words, however, would leave him questioning his entire existence. "What if I told you I could change that?" The words hung in the air, thick and charged, like a promise and a warning wrapped into one. Eli didn't know how to respond. He had seen enough to know that people with power never gave anything without expecting something in return. But there was something different about Musk's presence, something that felt like a test, a challenge. "I don't know what you want from me," Eli said, his voice a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. His instinct screamed at him to walk away, to trust no one in this city. But something in Musk's demeanor made it hard to turn down this strange offer, as if it was his only chance. Musk smiled, a small, knowing smile, as though he could see the struggle playing out in Eli's mind. "I want to offer you a job," he said, his tone decisive. "A chance to change your life, if you're willing to take it." Eli's breath caught in his throat. A job? From him? The offer felt unreal, as if the world had tilted off its axis. The boy who had no future was suddenly being handed the keys to one. But what was the catch? There had to be one. No one offered something like that for nothing. Before he could speak again, Musk raised a hand. "You don't have to decide now, but think about it. You'll be part of something bigger than yourself. You'll have the opportunity to change the world. Don't waste it." As quickly as he had appeared, Musk turned, retreating to the waiting car. The door closed with a soft thud, and the vehicle drove off, disappearing into the shadows from which it had come. Eli stood there, alone again, his mind racing. What just happened? What had he been offered? And more importantly, what was he supposed to do with it? The city remained as it had been, indifferent and unchanging. But Eli knew something had shifted within him. His life, once a series of aimless struggles, now seemed to be filled with an impossible possibility. A chance to escape, to transcend, to become something more. But the question lingered. Was he ready to take it? Or would he, like so many others before him, let this opportunity slip through his fingers? The days that followed Musk's offer were filled with a fevered uncertainty. Eli could hardly sleep, his mind tangled in questions and doubt. He wandered the streets like a ghost, his thoughts consumed by the stranger's words. A job, an opportunity. But how could someone like him, someone who had never been more than a nuisance to the world, be worthy of such a gift? And what exactly had Musk meant by changing the world? There was something cryptic in his words, a veiled promise that nagged at Eli's gut. The boy was used to being exploited, not elevated. He wrestled with himself, torn between skepticism and the undeniable allure of what Musk had suggested. Every encounter he had with others only deepened his confusion. The other kids in his group were equally suspicious, murmuring about how Musk only dealt with those who could offer something in return, how power brokers like him never acted out of goodwill. But Eli was too desperate to dismiss the offer outright. What if this was his one shot at something real? Days turned into weeks, and the wait became unbearable. Finally, Musk contacted him. A text, simply, "Meet me at the address below. Your future awaits." It was so clean, so final, as though a decision had already been made for him. He didn't hesitate. The address led him to a towering skyscraper on the edge of the city, gleaming under the night sky like a fortress of glass and steel. Eli's heart raced in his chest as he stepped through the revolving door, the chill of the lobby seeping into his skin. The air inside was sterile, polished, and impossibly cold. The guards, clad in dark suits, barely acknowledged him as he was led to an elevator. The doors closed with a soft chime, and as the lift ascended, Eli felt a sinking sensation in his stomach, as though the building itself was swallowing him whole. When the elevator finally opened, he was ushered into a large, minimalist office with glass walls overlooking the city. The view was breathtaking. Miles of lights twinkling below, each one a life, a story, a possibility. But it felt hollow in the moment, a reminder of the world that had always been out of reach. Musk was waiting for him, standing at the edge of the room, looking out over the city. His back was to Eli, his posture relaxed but undeniably authoritative. He didn't turn when Eli entered, but his voice cut through the silence like a knife. "I've been watching you, Eli. You have potential," Musk said, his tone distant, as though speaking to a subject under a microscope. "But potential means nothing unless you're willing to use it." Eli hesitated, the weight of Musk's words pressing down on him. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The offer, once a lifeline, now felt like a trap, its implications more profound than he had imagined. You're not just here for a job, Musk continued, turning to face him. His eyes gleamed with a strange intensity, the sharpness of a man who always saw more than what was in front of him. I've been looking for someone like you. Someone who can make the hard decisions. Someone who isn't afraid of the price that comes with power. Eli felt the room grow smaller, his pulse quickening. What do you mean? Musk walked toward him, each step deliberate, each movement calculated. I'm offering you the opportunity to work for me directly. Not just as an intern or some low-level grunt. No, you'll be part of my inner circle. A trusted ally. But there's a catch. A very simple one. Eli's stomach tightened. What's the catch? The catch is this, Musk said, his voice lowering, taking on a darker edge. You will be required to make decisions that will affect lives. You will have to sacrifice. You may not always agree with me, but you will follow my orders without question. If you can't handle that, then this will be the last time we speak. But if you can, then there's no limit to what we can accomplish together. Eli stared at him, his mind a whirlwind. He had grown up surrounded by betrayal, deception, and survival at any cost. But this felt different. The stakes were higher, the consequences more severe. He was being asked to give up his morals, to sell his soul for a shot at something bigger. Musk wasn't offering him a career or a future. He was offering him the chance to become part of a machine that had no room for weakness. I don't know if I can, Eli stammered, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to remain steady. Musk studied him, his expression unreadable. Everyone thinks they have a choice, Eli. But in the end, it's the choices you make that define you. This is your moment. Don't waste it. For a moment, Eli stood frozen, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. And then, as if something deep inside him snapped, he found his voice. I'm in. Musk's lips curled into a satisfied smile, but there was something in his eyes, a glint of calculation, that made Eli uneasy. The man turned toward the desk, tapping a few keys on a sleek, glass tablet. A file popped up on the screen, displaying a list of names, faces, and numbers. Your first task will be simple, Musk said, sliding the tablet toward Eli. You'll oversee a small project. Some people who have overstayed their welcome. It's a straightforward matter, but your role is crucial. The right decisions will shape everything. Eli's eyes skimmed over the screen, the names blurring in front of him. His mind refused to focus, overwhelmed by the weight of what Musk was asking. But there was no turning back now. He had chosen. As he left the office, his hands clenched into fists, the tablet still burning in his palm. The streets outside seemed brighter, the city alive in a way it never had been before. But in that brilliance, Eli could feel a shadow growing, looming just at the edge of his consciousness. He had crossed a line, a point of no return, but no sooner had he returned to the dilapidated apartment Musk had given him than the first twist arrived. A woman, a stranger to him, stood in his doorway. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and her presence was impossible to ignore. Her name was Anna, and she had been assigned as his partner in this new venture. She was sharp, more experienced, and infinitely more ruthless than Eli could ever hope to be. Her arrival was no coincidence. She had been watching him all along. The boss wants results, Anna said bluntly, her voice devoid of warmth. He doesn't tolerate failure. And neither do I. Eli was still processing everything. The offer, the weight of Musk's words, when Anna's revelation hit him like a slap to the face. Musk hadn't just offered him a job. He had set him up. This wasn't a partnership. It was a test, a game with rules that only Musk understood. The trust he thought he had built with Musk was fragile, a thin veneer hiding something darker. The first task came quickly, and it was more brutal than Eli could have ever imagined. A man named Gregor, a minor player in Musk's empire, had been deemed a liability. His offense was unclear. Perhaps it was greed, or maybe betrayal. But Musk had already made up his mind. Gregor had to go. Anna's cold indifference chilled Eli to his core as she explained the process. We don't ask questions. We do what needs to be done. But as they moved forward with the mission, Eli's resolve began to crack. Gregor wasn't some faceless enemy. He had a family, a past. Eli saw the fear in his eyes and realized he was no different from the man he was sent to destroy. Eli found himself at a crossroads. Would he follow Musk's orders, or would he choose a different path? His morals had already been tested, and he could feel the weight of betrayal creeping closer. The moral lines blurred, and Eli began to question who he was becoming. The night was suffocating, a dense cloud of tension hanging over Eli as he stared at the file on the table before him. His fingers trembled as he turned the last page, his breath catching in his throat. The mission had seemed simple at first: neutralize Gregor. But as he read the final note, a cold realization gnawed at him. This wasn't about eliminating a threat. This was about silence. Gregor wasn't a liability to Musk. He was a witness. Eli felt the blood drain from his face as the truth hit him. The deeper he had delved into Musk's world, the more the lines between right and wrong blurred. He had done terrible things in the name of survival, in the name of a future that he had been promised. But this was something darker, something that no amount of ambition or power could justify. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and for the first time in weeks, Eli felt a rush of panic. The kind of panic that came from seeing your own reflection in the mirror and not recognizing the person staring back at you. He had trusted Musk, believed in the lies that had been fed to him. Musk had given him the world on a silver platter, and Eli had swallowed it whole. But now, in this sterile room filled with polished surfaces and empty promises, Eli realized that his loyalty had been nothing more than a currency to be traded. Anna appeared at the door, her cold eyes locking onto his. She didn't need to ask what was going on. She already knew. There was something in the way she watched him that sent a shiver down his spine. Anna had always been ruthless, her loyalty to Musk unwavering. But now, Eli saw her for what she truly was: another cog in the machine, another pawn in a game he no longer wanted to play. "Eli," she said, her voice smooth, almost comforting, "you need to understand something. This isn't personal. It's business." Eli's hands clenched into fists. He could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears, the sound of it deafening. "Business?" he spat, his voice trembling with fury. "You're telling me that murdering someone for the sake of keeping a secret is business?" Anna's face remained impassive, her expression betraying no emotion. "It's not about morals. It's about control. We control the narrative, Eli. That's how you stay on top. And if that means cutting ties with people who could jeopardize everything, then so be it." Eli's mind was a whirlwind, his thoughts racing as he tried to make sense of the words. But they only grew more distorted with every passing second. He had made his choice. He had joined Musk's world. But this was beyond anything he had imagined. This wasn't a chance to rise above the streets. This was a prison, one with no escape. He had thought that power meant freedom, but all it had given him was a front-row seat to the destruction of everything he had once believed in. "You knew," Eli said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You knew what this was all along, didn't you? You were never here to help me. You were just another part of the system that's been using me." Anna's lips curled into a thin smile. "You should have known better than to trust Musk. No one gets to where he is by playing nice." The words stung like a slap to the face, and for a moment, Eli couldn't breathe. He had allowed himself to believe that there was some semblance of humanity in this world, that maybe, just maybe, he could escape the cycle of betrayal that had defined his life. But now, standing before Anna, he saw the truth for what it was. There was no escape. There was only power, and those who wielded it. Musk had never offered him a future. He had offered him a role in his game, a game where the rules were written by the most ruthless players. Eli's fists were shaking now, his entire body trembling with the fury of his realization. He had been a fool. He had let himself be manipulated, used as a pawn in a game that he didn't even understand. And now, the person who had promised him everything had shown his true face: cold, calculating, and incapable of mercy. "You're going to kill Gregor," Eli said, his voice a low, guttural growl. "But you won't stop there, will you? You'll keep feeding me lies until I'm just as much of a monster as you are." Anna didn't flinch. She stepped closer to him, her gaze unwavering. "You don't get to make demands. Not anymore. You're in this whether you like it or not." But the defiance in Eli's chest was starting to ignite, his rage a roaring fire that threatened to consume him. He had been betrayed, but he wasn't going to let this be the end. Not yet. He turned on his heel, making for the door, but Anna was faster. She grabbed his arm, her grip like iron. "Where do you think you're going?" she asked, her voice cold and threatening. "I'm getting out of here," Eli snapped, yanking his arm free. "I'm done." Anna's eyes flashed with a cold calculation, and before he could react, she pulled out a small, sleek device from her jacket pocket. "You can't just walk away from this, Eli," she said, her tone almost regretful. "Musk doesn't tolerate failure, and neither do I." The device in her hand beeped, and Eli's world exploded into chaos. The sound of an explosion echoed in his ears, and the floor beneath him seemed to shift, throwing him off balance. His heart hammered in his chest as the building around him trembled, the walls vibrating with a violent force. The room was suddenly filled with blinding light, followed by the deafening roar of flames. Eli's instincts kicked in, and he dove for cover, narrowly avoiding a burst of debris that rained down from above. The shockwave sent him sprawling to the ground, his body slamming into the cold floor with a sickening thud. He gasped for breath, the air thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning metal. His head spun, and his vision blurred. But through the haze, one thought pierced through the fog of panic. Anna had just set him up. He scrambled to his feet, panic rising in his chest as he looked around for an escape. The building was coming down around him, and there was no time to think, no time to plan. The flames spread faster than he could run, and the walls groaned under the pressure of the destruction. He reached for the door, but as his fingers touched the handle, a voice rang out behind him. "Leaving so soon?" Musk's voice was like ice, and Eli froze. His blood ran cold at the sound, the man's presence suffocating him. Eli turned slowly, his legs shaking with the weight of everything he had just learned. Musk stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his hands in his pockets as if he had orchestrated this entire disaster from the very beginning. "You never understood the game, Eli," Musk said, his voice cold and final. "You thought you could play by your own rules, but in the end, everyone plays by mine." Eli's body went rigid with a mix of rage and betrayal. He had been nothing more than a pawn, a tool in a game that Musk had already won. And as the flames licked at the walls and the ceiling above them began to crumble, Eli realized that this was the ultimate betrayal. Musk hadn't offered him a job, he had offered him a cage. And now, as the world burned around him, Eli understood that there was no escape. Not anymore. Eli's mind was a shattered mirror, each piece reflecting a different version of himself, some with anger, some with regret, others with disbelief. He had known pain before, had learned to survive in the harshest conditions, but this was a betrayal that cut deeper than anything he had ever experienced. The fire still raged in the building behind him, a metaphor for the destruction within. The flames had consumed everything, leaving only ash and ruin. His own life, it seemed, had been scorched beyond recognition. As he stumbled through the smoldering wreckage, the truth of Musk's cruelty continued to claw at him. Eli had been nothing but a tool, an expendable tool, a means to an end. And yet, the hardest truth to swallow wasn't that Musk had betrayed him. It was that Eli had allowed himself to be manipulated, had given up every part of himself in exchange for the illusion of power. When he had first walked into that office, standing in awe of Musk's empire, Eli had believed that he could finally leave behind the fear, the desperation. But now, as he stood on the precipice of his own destruction, it was impossible to ignore the cruelty of the world he had stepped into. There was no victory here, no redemption, only the hollow echo of broken promises. Eli had barely made it out of the building before the chaos erupted. He had been too far gone in his own fury and despair to hear the sirens in the distance, to sense the approaching law enforcement. His only thought was to escape, to put as much distance between himself and the wreckage as possible. He couldn't bear to think about Gregor, about the blood on his hands, or the twisted game he had been forced to play. But as he found himself walking the streets again, nothing felt familiar. The weight of what had happened pressed down on him like a 100-ton weight. The faces of the people he passed were indifferent, as though they had no idea that a revolution had just imploded behind closed doors, a revolution that had promised to change everything. In reality, the world had moved on without him. The shadows of the city swallowed him whole. Days turned into weeks. News of the explosion spread quickly, and rumors swirled about the incident. People whispered about the mysterious explosion that had claimed the life of one of Musk's closest confidants, Gregor, and how it had been a carefully orchestrated move to eliminate a threat. But no one knew the truth. No one knew that the destruction had been far more personal, that Musk's empire had fractured from within. Eli had disappeared into the underbelly of the city, hiding from the wreckage he had left behind. The people who once knew him as a homeless, desperate boy now only remembered him as the nameless face in the shadow of the explosion. But even in the darkest corners of the world, Eli couldn't escape the emptiness that gnawed at him. He had been a pawn in a game that wasn't his to play, and now nothing made sense. His dreams of power had crumbled into dust, and the promise of a new life seemed like a cruel joke. In his solitude, Eli reflected on the choices that had brought him here. He thought about the first time he had met Musk, the way the man had looked at him, the promises he had made. There had been a fire in Musk's eyes, a certainty that had made Eli believe that anything was possible. But now, Eli could see that fire for what it truly was, an illusion, a mask to hide the darkness beneath. Musk had never cared about him. He had only seen Eli as a stepping stone, a tool to be used, and when the boy had outlived his usefulness, he was discarded. The betrayal had cut deeper than any wound, not because of the violence, but because of the truth it revealed. Eli had been a fool to trust someone like Musk, to believe that he could be more than a pawn in a game designed to break him. The world had swallowed him whole, and now there was nothing left but the hollow ache of broken promises. But in the quiet of his despair, something began to shift within Eli. The anger and the hopelessness still burned hot, but in their wake, there was a flicker of clarity. The man he had become, the person who had surrendered to the allure of power, wasn't him. He was a reflection of everything he had been told to be, a puppet on strings that had been pulled by someone who didn't care about him. The realization was slow, but it was there. He had been given a second chance, even if it was one he had never asked for. Eli could keep running, keep hiding in the shadows, but that wouldn't erase the truth of what he had done. It wouldn't change the damage he had caused, or the man he had allowed himself to become. The choice now was his. He could rebuild, or he could continue to crumble. He could let the past define him, or he could face it head-on and take control of his own destiny. But there was no going back. He couldn't undo the choices he had made, but maybe, just maybe, he could make something better out of the ashes. As Eli disappeared into the night, the weight of his past still heavy on his shoulders, he knew one thing for certain. The world had changed, and so had he. The fire inside him still burned, but now it was a fire of reckoning. A fire that could either consume him or forge him into something new. And as the city stretched out before him, a place of both chaos and possibility, Eli took a deep breath, ready to step into the unknown once more. The city stretched out before Eli, its skyline like jagged teeth in the distance, as though mocking him for ever believing he could fit into its gleaming, soulless expanse. It was a world that had promised so much, a future shaped by power and influence, a place where he could rise from the ruins of his past. But now, as the dim light of dawn broke over the horizon, Eli understood that those promises had been nothing more than a mirage, a dream sold to the desperate. In the quiet aftermath of the explosion, the destruction had been undeniable. Gregor's life had been claimed, a casualty of Musk's ruthless empire, but Eli's soul had been the one left broken in its wake. The man who had once been a mere shadow, a homeless boy with nothing to lose, had transformed into something more, a player in a game he never understood, a tool in the hands of someone far more dangerous than he had ever realized. And yet, as Eli stood at the edge of the city, the weight of everything pressing down on him, he felt a strange sense of clarity. The journey he had taken, the betrayal, the loss, the destruction, had not been in vain. It had forced him to confront the parts of himself he had hidden away, the parts that longed for something more than survival, more than just a momentary taste of power. It had pushed him to a breaking point, where he had no choice but to rebuild from the wreckage of his own making. Eli's arc was one of transformation, not in the traditional sense of redemption, but in the more brutal sense of self-awareness. He hadn't found salvation, There was no easy redemption in a world this broken, but he had found the courage to see the truth, to confront the darkness within himself that had allowed him to become a pawn in a game he couldn't control. And while the future was uncertain, Eli understood that he had a choice now, not to fix the past, but to shape what came next. His heart still burned with anger, but it was a different kind of fire now. The fury that had once consumed him, driving him toward vengeance and power, had cooled into something more controlled, more reflective. The world that had once seemed like a maze of endless opportunity now appeared for what it truly was: a cruel, unforgiving place where power was wielded by the few and broken dreams were the currency of the many. But even in that harsh reality, Eli had found something worth fighting for: his own truth. Musk, the man who had promised him everything, had revealed himself to be nothing more than a shadow in the light of Eli's new understanding. Musk's empire was built on lies, manipulation, and power that sought only to control. He had given Eli nothing but a gilded cage, a false hope that had led him astray. But even Musk's betrayal had been a catalyst, a necessary wake-up call that shattered Eli's illusions and forced him to take a hard look at the cost of ambition. The world hadn't changed, not really, but Eli had. His role in the city was no longer defined by what he had been given, but by what he could create for himself. The question now was whether he would fall into the same patterns of power and destruction that had shaped his life until that point, or whether he would carve out a new path, one built on the lessons learned from the rubble. As Eli walked away from the city, the wind brushing against his face, there was no grand resolution, no sweeping moment of victory, only the quiet, steady pulse of a man who had come to terms with his past and now stood on the edge of something new. There was no guarantee of success, no promise of redemption, but there was a sense of possibility, however faint. A possibility that, for the first time, he could choose his own way. Trust. It had been shattered in ways he couldn't even begin to explain. The very idea of trust now seemed like a distant memory, a luxury he could no longer afford. He had placed his faith in the wrong people, believed in the lies they had told him. But the real betrayal, Eli realized, hadn't come from Musk or Anna or Gregor. The real betrayal had come from himself, from the part of him that had been willing to sacrifice everything for a dream that was never meant to be. Morality had always been a fluid concept in the world Eli had inhabited, a world where survival came first and the rules were constantly shifting. But through the wreckage, through the chaos, he had learned that morality wasn't defined by what others told him to believe. It wasn't a set of rigid rules, nor was it something that could be manipulated for gain. It was something personal, something he had to shape for himself, and that understanding had given him a new kind of strength, an understanding that even in the darkest of worlds, there was still room for a glimmer of humanity. The city behind him was already beginning to change, its people continuing their lives with little awareness of the storm that had passed through. But Eli knew better. The world would always be broken, always filled with shadows and lies. But he no longer had to be defined by that. He no longer had to be a part of it. The fire inside him could burn brighter than any empire, brighter than any ambition. And for the first time, he felt the weight of that freedom. As the sun rose over the horizon, casting long shadows on the city, Eli took a step forward. It was small, insignificant even, but it was a step nonetheless. A step towards something that could be better, something that could be his. And as the world around him continued to spin, oblivious to the choices he had made, Eli found solace in the thought that, for once, he was no longer running. He was walking into the unknown, a place where the only certainty was that he would shape his own fate.